Hi, I'm Brian Hu, and I am the Artistic Director of the San Diego Asian Film Festival. I'm so pleased to be able to co-present this panel discussion with the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, where I spent countless days and nights as an intern, a student, a journalist, and a budding cinephile countless years ago. And I'm especially pleased to be able to collaborate on the occasion of Evan Chan's essential new film, We Have Boots. As you know, Chan's documentary is about the events in Hong Kong of the past 6 years. As a medium, documentary is so good at asking questions of recent history, or being on the ground to capture events unfolding so that they can be preserved for the archives. But we acknowledge that the political situation in Hong Kong is not just one of the recent past, but one that is ongoing, shifting, and regenerating, even despite the seemingly intractable national security law passed earlier this year. And so we wanted to not only talk with filmmaker and film subject about the umbrella movement and the anti-extradition protests, but we wanted to bring in scholars who can put these events in a political and legal context that is still crucial for understanding the passions for self-determination that have not been extinguished. And so we have what promises to be a lively conversation with award-winning New York and Hong Kong-based filmmaker Evan Chan, and one of the social activists featured in We Have Boots, Alex Yongkong Chow, who is currently a doctoral student in geography at UC Berkeley. They'll be joined by Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT Austin, and an affiliate of the university's Strauss Center and Clemens Center on National Security. Moderating the discussion is Rachel Stern, Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Berkeley, where she also holds the Pamela P. Fong and Family Distinguished Chair in China Studies. Welcome to all of our distinguished guests. Rachel, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks so much, Brian. I appreciate it. And it's such a joy to be here to discuss this film with you. I want to start, of course, with the director and turn it over to Evans for our first question. I think anytime an audience member comes to a film, the question that we want to know the answer to is how the film came about and how you envision the intended audience. And here I have a little bit of background knowledge, which is I know it's like started out as a coda to your earlier documentary on the umbrella movement, Raise the Umbrellas. And of course, this film chronicles the political fallout that followed the umbrella movement. But I wanted to hear a little bit from you about how the film came about, and as you were making it, how you envisioned people coming to see it.
Of course, I mean, it started with the umbrella movement. I find it a very interesting coincidence in my life. And the US and Hong Kong or Chinese connection in my life. One of the close friends I had in New York was Harvey Shapiro. I knew him the last 10 years of his life. He died in 2013. And he was the editor he was the New York Book Review editor as well as the Sunday magazine editor. And one of his major assignments given to Martin Luther King was when he knew that he was going to jail, Birmingham, he said, why don't you write something? And that's how the letter from Birmingham jail came about. So I always find that be faithful. You know, in 2013, I attended his, in 2014, he died in 2013. By the time I went to his memorial was in 2014. And the umbrella movement started. And so I went back, and the moment I talked to Benny Tai, the first thing he mentioned was his primary inspiration of launching the Occupy in Hong Kong was that seminal piece on civil disobedience by Martin Luther King. So I was really taken aback. And actually the producer of this film, Williams Cole, is the stepson of Harvey Shapiro. So it was, I always find it a very interesting connection in my life, other than my personal story outside of that framework. So, you know, I made the film about the umbrella movement. I felt sad because the first reaction I was to the Occupy movement, I was, you know, why did we come to this point? I don't see it's fun. I mean, it end up to be festive, and I mean, there's the carnival experience to it. I mean, it's true of a lot of mass movement, but I mean, the cause of it, you know, make you wonder. There has to be some deep-seated social issues and social conflicts that brought that movement about, and then it was crushed. Or, you know, it wasn't, you know, a violent crackdown that ended, but I mean, some technicality, but still, you know, people were removed. The occupied zone was closed. I finished that film in travel a little bit, and then in 2018, I was asked to deliver a lecture on civil disobedience and Martin Luther King's legacy in Asia by the Lingnan University in Hong Kong, which also was presenting a retrospective of my work, not a complete retrospective. They were showing Raise the Umbrellas, and then I was just thinking I'll do a little film as a companion piece about the Hong Kong situation. Then when I start talking to Benny Tai, you know, Chen Ki-man, you know, all these key players of Occupy, they were already very involved in their upcoming trial. And so I saw all these changes emerging in Hong Kong, the disqualification situation, and already we had one political refugee fleeing Hong Kong already. So, I mean, so that came about, and then, so I kept expanding it. So at the beginning, it was just like a work in progress. It began as a 70 minutes film, and then it grew and grew. And then by the time it was premiered at Rotterdam this year, the 2019 anti-extradition movement protest was also featured in that film. And I guess, you know, it was mostly the last 30 minutes that got a lot of interest because of how that movement got international attention at the time. Now, in terms of audience, I mean, it's very difficult. That kind of film is difficult to make and difficult to get out. And there seems to be some larger political pressure out there to contain this kind of film from Hong Kong. So, I mean, I was a journalist, and I turned to documentary filmmaking. You always feel that there is a responsibility, ethics, and urgency in bearing witness to history, to look at its unfolding. Some of you may call that a first draft of history. I would call maybe a second draft, because by the time you make a documentary, already you are dealing with something that is in history, especially by the time the documentary meets the audience, is behind the events a little bit. But so, I mean, you are always dealing with storytelling in that respect. You know, the past, or how to understand his history. I mean, my early inspiration or my lifetime inspiration has always been Hannah Arendt's political philosophy. It was her last teaching assistant, Jerome Cohen, that recruited me to study in New York at the New School, you know, some 30 years ago. And I always, feel strongly influenced by her sense of, you know, bearing witness and to some extent vindicating losers in history. So, or, you know, the sense of history is to actually allow both sides' voices to be heard, not just the winner, but also the loser. So, I mean, I always feel that there is a sense of justice at play, even in terms of bearing witness. So I hope that, you know, it can reach as many audiences as possible. So I'm very thankful that it was It had its premiere in Rotterdam, then this US and UK premiere. In the UK, it's Sheffield documentary, and then in the US, it's FilmFest DC. And this is such a great opportunity for the film, and along with my two other films to be seen again in two excellent platforms in Berkeley and also San Diego. So I'm very, very thankful for that.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, that sense of bearing witness in history was one of the things for me that was so powerful about the film. Like, to see the whole period. It's, you know, there's footage from the umbrella movement, and then the very end, there's just a tiny bit about the national security law, because the film, you must have been editing as that was passed. And to see all those events kind of within 1 2-hour block, I had this sense of telescoping of history, of seeing it as a concrete period, as someone who had been sort of following the news as it came out. Let me turn it over to Alex. Alex, of course, you're a character in the film. There's an interview with you. Can you bring us up to date? You're here at Berkeley in our geography department as a PhD student. I'm curious what you're up to. And in the film, you mentioned that you want to go back to Hong Kong and be a university professor. And I'm curious how your thinking on that might have changed.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel, for your question. And also thanks, Evans, for bringing us together. Because you could tell from my background, like, I use a UC campus background, because now I'm a doctoral student at UC Berkeley. So this is my 3rd year at Berkeley. I've been studying at Berkeley for the past 3 years. It is kind of like a torturing and alienating experience. When I decided to pursue, for further studies after the umbrella movement, one of the motivation is that, I want to know the world better, because I felt like by then, simply by occupying the streets for more than 3 months, it doesn't seem to change the regime. It also doesn't seem to bring a real change in Hong Kong. Then students or young folks like me start to ask questions like, how did we get here? And where should we go? What could we do? What happened in the past? And what is waiting ahead for us in the future? And at that point, I felt like there's an intellectual hunger for me. I feel like I need to know more, so I could propose a more persuasive solution to myself and my peers and others. And at that point, I felt like we really lack the historical knowledge because we are once the colonial subjects. Hong Kong was once a British colony. And we really don't know the dynamics happened in the past, and what is the nitty gritty that really result in different conflict, and how do we get here? And that's why I felt like I should go for further studies, and hence I went to the UK, and then I came to the US. So on the one hand, I felt very grateful to have a period of time to really dive into different intellectual work. To get more perspective in analyzing what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in the world, especially when we are seeing the clash between the US and China in terms of trade war and other confrontation that might be emerging. But on the other hand, I also felt it is a very lonely and torturing experience. As nowadays, people from Hong Kong, they've started to use the term diaspora. And many people who are overseas, they really feel like we are part of the diaspora community. It seems like there's a disconnection, or the connection between people in overseas and people in Hong Kong. People are being disconnecting, especially after the national security law that was introduced earlier in July this year. People felt it might be more difficult and challenging to tell whether people who are vocal could return to Hong Kong, and whether they could return to Hong Kong safely and get out of Hong Kong, say for me to return to the US for study. So there are a lot of things going on, and so it seems like there are lots of possibilities as a youngster still, although I'm also reaching 30s, but there's also a lot of anxiety, given what happened in Evan's film, what we saw last year. So yeah, Rachel, your question is a really difficult one to answer and address. because there's no guaranteed future like well for folks in Hong Kong, and it seems like you have like multiple trajectory and no one can tell what lies ahead.
That's a really honest answer. Yeah, I think the nationals, I'll just offer a little bit of context for people who are watching who might not know what the national security law is. This is passed in June 2020. And so in a sense, the film that you just watched can be said to have straddled 2 eras, before the national security law and after. And then concretely, the national security law, which is passed, defines increased prison sentences up to life in prison for succession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. And it's widely understood to have been passed as a way to push back against the umbrella movement and the subsequent waves of activism in Hong Kong. And already several prominent people, including Jimmy Lai, who's the editor of Apple Daily, have been arrested under the new national security law. So that's the context, just a little bit of context about what Alex is saying about whether or not it's possible for anyone who's been as visibly involved in the recent protests to go back to Hong Kong. And I think it's probably something that all of us who study China are dealing with in different ways as it affects our lives. But of course, it affects your life particularly directly, Alex. Let me bring Sheena in on this too. Oh, I see Evans. Evans, please.
I just, because what you just brought that up, I want to point out that Agnes Chow in the film was also arrested for, that incitement to a secession. And also Ray Wong, who was also in the film, who became already political refugee, and was his political asylum application was accepted in Germany, and he became on the wanted list, because of also committing those offenses. So so two people in the film are already being affected by the new law.
Thanks. I should have mentioned Agnes, and I forgot about Ray as well. Let me bring Sheena in on this, because I think in this, of course, the film chronicles the political repression in Hong Kong and their dynamics between Hong Kong and China. But the third party in this, sort of the shadow third party, is the United States. So I think we have to also talk about how this is unfolding against the backdrop of US politics. Sheena, I'm curious, as you watch the film, and of course being an expert on US-China relations, how, if at all, you think that the last 4 years might have unfolded differently under a different president? Is there a Donald Trump effect kind of happening in the background of this film?
That's a really tough question to answer, because on the one hand, what we've seen is that over the past 4 years, there has been a global decline in democracy, or some risk of democratic backsliding in a number of countries around the world, and that in some ways the pandemic has contributed to or accelerated the autocratization of a range of countries around the world. That autocracies have used the pandemic, and weak democracies have put measures in place, or been emboldened to put measures in place that really do undermine democracy and global civil liberties. So I think that it's possible to think about, how the future might have looked different. I certainly think, for example, we might have different conversations about refugee policy playing out if we had an administration that had maintained the refugee cap rather than lowering it dramatically, which is one of the things that we've seen under the Trump administration. We may well have seen other forms of activism, stronger statements. I think we probably would have seen more multilateral diplomacy. For example, at the UN, we wouldn't have seen a withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council. And so I think there are some very concrete places where the US response would have looked different. One of the things, though, that I think it's important to keep in mind is that, so I work on US-China relations, but I also work a lot on domestic security policy in China. And that one of the things that we're seeing here is that Hong Kong has been defined and in some ways redefined as a matter of CCP and PRC national security, which is a term that Xi Jinping has used. It's sort of a key doctrine of his administration is this adoption of a more comprehensive national security policy, meaning that threats to national security can come from a much broader range of places, a much more expansive set of issues than existed previously, under previous Chinese leadership. And so, I think that tells us that this is a very, very tough situation for both activists in Hong Kong and for the international community or the United States to try to make a dent in, because Hong Kong has been framed as integral to Xi Jinping's nationalist China project, right? The return of Hong Kong in '97 was seen as restoration of lost national territory that was lost to colonial encroachment in the century of humiliation. But it's also been placed at now in a framework that is really central to how Xi Jinping approaches, I think, almost every challenging issue in China, which is to see it as a matter of internal security and societal control. And so I see some parallels between some of what's unfolded in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. And we actually know that the police forces have done some exchanges, which in the course of the last year or two, talking about different approaches and methods of policing. And I will say that one of the moments that I thought was sort of smartest and most jarring in this film was the moment where the police ad was juxtaposed with actual footage on the streets, because it allows viewers to see for themselves the narrative that the CCP wants to put forward and that the Hong Kong authorities want to put forward about policing in Hong Kong, and the reality of what was unfolding from the perspective of people who were experiencing it directly. And I think that form of juxtaposing those narratives is so critical to the project of bearing witness, because we need to see what's being said and how things are being framed while we're looking at how they're unfolding. But the point here is just to say that I think any administration is going to, we may see more effort under different administrations or different lines of effort, but I think we shouldn't underestimate how fundamentally difficult it would be to move Xi Jinping and the CCP off their present course in Hong Kong because of the way they've constructed the image. It really, the image of Hong Kong, it really, they have not left themselves a lot of room to back down from a pretty repressive course of action. And as someone who watches US-China relations, who's been to Hong Kong, who's gone to a June 4th vigil in previous years, and found that incredibly moving. That concerns me deeply, that the options seem to be so limited and that the CCP's commitment to its present course seems pretty high.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. And thank you for putting that piece on the table. It's hard to watch the film and not come away feeling pessimistic. I mean, in so many ways, it's a chronicle of political repression. Evans, when we spoke on the phone, you described the situation as frozen in Hong Kong. Can you say a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Only frozen more from with the long view. I mean, but there is still a lot of there was protests, but then they were quickly suppressed, and they still apply for a license to march and rally on the street, and they were not getting it. I mean, what I mean frozen is after the umbrella movement, so people do not anticipate such an outburst, eruption of action like 2019. So is there a chance for Hong Kong to, for us to see another moment like that in Hong Kong? Is it still possible? I've talked to other Hong Kong watchers, international journalists, and we have the feeling that the changes in Hong Kong is accelerating. I mean, all your old assumptions are out of the window. I think at the very beginning, when they staged Occupy, they were still thinking in the colonial days. I mean, that kind of civil disobedience, blocking the traffic, you know, sit in, sit down, and all that, you may be thrown to jail for 1 or 2 days, or you may have a fine of, you know, not very much. And then, I mean, now, it became the trial, I mean, for a year or so, I mean, of imprisonment, basically is a totally peaceful. And then, of course, even in terms of my own experience of even showing the film in Hong Kong, even though it was difficult at the beginning, it was just getting worse and worse. I'm not going to name the places. I mean, like the premiere of Raise the Umbrella was canceled by Asia Society, which is, you know, essentially an American institution, and then the Hong Kong Center canceled the premiere, and then afterwards, and the film, you know, was picked up by other institutions, but by the time Bush come around, again the room is decreasing. In terms of censorship situation, I mean, no organizations want to touch Weir Bush right now. Very recently, there are 2 activist documentaries. One is about the occupation of the Electoral Council last July 1st, 2019. That's part of the anti-extradition movement. There's a documentary about that. There is a documentary about the siege of Polytechnic University. Both films we thought would be banned, but apparently it was not banned. I just found out, you know, this week or so. But there was some sort of a demand to put a disclaimer in the film, saying that some action depicted in the film would be could be construed as illegal under the current law. So I don't know whether that's giving me a ray of hope. Maybe, you know, if a disclaimer announcement like that placed in front of the film, you know, then maybe the film could be seen in Hong Kong again. I don't know. But at this point, I have conversation with a couple of places. It all collapsed at the end. I mean, even though the organizers are, oh, we are defending press freedom, this is what we wanted to do, this is our mandate, end up backing down. So it is a tough situation in terms of censorship. It is tightening, as though it's not, I mean, they did not close Apple Daily right away, for example, but you know, we don't know how it's going to happen, and you can see the grip is tightening.
Yeah, Alex, one of the things that I'm sure is on your mind that I'm sure you're part of conversations about is what it's possible for a diaspora to do at a moment when I'm sure many are thinking about whether or not it's safe to go back to Hong Kong under the national security law. What's it possible to achieve sitting in Berkeley and Germany and London and all the different places that the activists who were involved in the umbrella movement and the aftermath have dispersed to? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about that? And you may be right in the middle of it, which is okay too, but I'm curious to listen in a little bit on that conversation.
The ongoing conversation is a really complicated one. Like complicated in a sense, like folks do not have consensus on what is the right way to do. So it seems like, well, folks are all competing about like, well, what is the right path? What is the right method? But you can see one dominant emerging scene that like, well, people are thinking about. One dominant tactic is that folks starting from last year, they were thinking about like, well, Hong Kong activists in Hong Kong or Hong Kong diaspora community, they're thinking about how to create global solidarity or to like, well, bring in more allies to counter the Chinese regime, the CCP regime. And one thing that is in their mind is that like, well, countries all over the world, they should rethink their trade relationship with China and how they should like rethink the economic partnership with China, whether that is sustainable and whether like, well, countries and NGOs, they should participate in a global project that should all sanction China in a way to force it to rethink its policy towards Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and other places. So that is like, well, one very strong demand, like, well, coming from Hong Kong people. But at the same time, it's also very controversial in the sense that, like, well, what part of the government should you ally with? Are you like, well, siding with the right-leaning politicians, or are you like siding with the left-leaning politicians? And people don't have a consensus on that. And it also creates confusion and debate on like, well, whether that is the right move and or whether that's an effective move. But perhaps like out of desperation, people felt like, well, given the experience of the 2014 umbrella movement, people felt like, well, the Hong Kong resistance can't only be a local resistance. It has to be a global one. And that's why like we have to think on the global level. And when it comes to the global level, then it is about like, well, the collaboration with government, with different politicians, and how to like, well, use their power to exert leverage and exert pressure on the Chinese government. So that seems to like, well, one way to go, but like, well, you also see a lot of people having a lot of reservation because like take US as an example, like, well, you have like President Trump, like, well, launching a trade war with China, then surely you could say like, well, if we could cut off the economic connection between US and China, and perhaps it would put China's economic condition into pressure. Like, well, it might face a challenge to rethink how it could, like China might have to think like how it could like export its products to other places, whether there are still other consumer market that could fulfill the need. But you also have a lot of people thinking about whether this is a right strategy. Perhaps it would damage the well-being of the Chinese workers who might not necessarily be supporters of the CCP regime. And what is the alternative? And that's really a big question that people don't have an answer right now.
Yeah, I've heard that critique of some of the lobbying that's been done by some of the democracy activists in Hong Kong, that they've cultivated relationships with the more hawkish figures in the DC foreign policy establishment, and in so doing have pushed the US a step closer to a Cold War with China. But this is a really complicated foreign policy landscape in the United States. And even as someone who watches closely, I'm not sure that I even fully understand it. So I can understand how, you know, coming into it, it's tricky to figure out what to do. One of the things that I've, to be candid, found confusing is that when I listen to Nancy Pelosi and Marco Rubio on Hong Kong, they actually sound more similar than different. These are unusual political bedfellows, to say the least. So I'm curious, I mean, you know, again, bringing in the US foreign policy angle, Sheena, how do you see it? Is this a Democratic Republican issue, or is that just not the right way to look at this?
You know, there are some partisan differences in how people look at China and how people look at the human rights issues that have come to the fore in places like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and across China. And so, you know, for example, I was looking through some of the recent Chicago Council and Pew data, and you see that actually, if you ask a survey question, Democratic respondents are a little bit more likely to say the United States should emphasize human rights concerns in its dealings with China, up to and including taking an economic hit, right? So should the United States emphasize human rights, even if that means damage to the US-China economic relationship? And we see that a fair amount of bipartisan agreement on the answer being yes. So although we see Democrats, you know, emphasizing or responding more positively to a traditional human rights question, we also see that on the Republican side, on the American right, there's a fair amount of emphasis on framing it in terms of anti-communism and the lack of freedom in an anti-communist system, as well as violations of religious freedom. And so I think the framing language and the language that cues people to think about human rights concerns and lack of freedom is a little bit different on the right and the left. So depending on what survey you ask, you might see partisan differences. There's actually, I think, a fair amount of bipartisan concern, especially as it relates to what's going on in Hong Kong. And if I could just follow up maybe a little bit on what Alex was saying a moment ago about the diaspora. Some of my my other work is focused on the role that authoritarian diasporas can play, particularly because I do some research on North Korea and have been interested in the role of the North Korean diaspora. I actually think that that's quite instructive for thinking about you know, what we might see in the case of Hong Kong. And so we know, as we think about historically about authoritarian environments or places where political repression intensifies, that as mobilization and contention in a specific place become increasingly impossible, that the diaspora can emerge as a really important site of extraterritorial contention. And I think we are starting to see that with Hong Kong and with China more broadly, where there's been more and more attention to a struggle for control over the diaspora. Right? Xi Jinping refers to the Chinese diaspora as national assets. And the clear expectation is that they will toe the party line, so to speak. And then we've seen pushback from within the diaspora, from places where at the borders of this contention, university campuses, issues of academic freedom, a lot of that involves Chinese student populations and the diaspora who are often at heightened risk for and vulnerable to repression. And that's something I think we should keep in mind here. It's really obvious when we listen to someone like Alex or when we watch this film. But I think when we're talking about actual policy, sometimes that point gets a bit lost. And the other thing I think that, you know, if I was in Beijing, I would be thinking really hard about whether the crackdown in Hong Kong, to the extent that we've seen it post passage of the national security law, is going to be worth the trade if what it does is take some of the smartest, most capable, most committed activists and Hong Kongers and pushes them into an extraterritorial network. That could actually amplify and internationalize support for Hong Kong in a way that could backfire and could rebound negatively from Beijing's perspective, right? And so even from the standpoint of what's in Beijing's self-interest, I'm not sure the current strategy is smart, thinking about diaspora politics and how we've seen that dynamic play out in other authoritarian affiliated diasporas. So it's a really interesting and important question, and I think we'll hear more and more about it in the coming days and years.
Thanks. I just realized I should have said the CCP is the Chinese Communist Party, for anyone who's watching who doesn't use that an acronym all the time. I'm used to it. No. I'm totally forgotten. The diaspora is interesting, and I can't help it because Alex and I are both on the Berkeley campus. Alex, I'm so curious to hear what your experience of diaspora politics has been like here at Berkeley in particular. Berkeley is such an interesting site. I teach Chinese law and politics here on this campus. It's such an interesting place to do that because everyone's in the classroom. We have exchange students from mainland China. We have students from mainland China who are doing their BA at Berkeley. We have students from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, every generation of Chinese American immigration. It's just every single version of Asian American identity that you can imagine is in the classroom. So now over the last 3 years, I'm really curious what your experience of Hong Kong politics has been like in this particular place in America.
It seems like the conflict in the past few years really complicates the idea of diaspora community. When we talk about Chinese diaspora, maybe we tend to see like one homogeneous group. But since perhaps like the umbrella movement and the ongoing conflict in the past few years, the identity of Hong Konger, of Hong Kong people, it is really on the increased side. And you can see like young folks or old folks who are on the pro-democracy side, they would tend to identify themselves as Hong Kongers instead of Chinese. So like on Berkeley campus, you could also see a very similar trend. Like whenever you are on a panel about Hong Kong's movement or Hong Kong's resistance, you will always see maybe 3 to 4 types of broad category audience. One type is Hong Kong people asking what you can do or what we can do. And the second type is the Chinese audience, perhaps like students or folks from China. They would say like, why Hong Kong people hate Chinese so much? And whether you could tell like, well, when there's like such a high degree of hatred in Hong Kong about like, well, between Hong Konger and Chinese, whether you could still classify that as a progressive movement. So that's one classic question from the Chinese audience. And then you have like the Taiwanese audience saying like, well, given the really intimate partnership between Hong Konger and Taiwanese in the past few years, what is the future ahead? And then you have the fourth type, like Americans, and they are like basically onlookers, or they are like, well, sympathetic towards Hong Kong, and they'll ask like, well, what we can do and what's next? So it's like a really a mix of combination of like what happened. So perhaps this also give folks a sense about like what is going on. So you have this kind of like a very dynamic, broadly speaking, Chinese diaspora community, but they also are very nuanced. They are very different depending on their age and when they come to the US, whether they are more pro-democracy or more pro-CCP, or they are pro-CCP regime. That said, you also have young Chinese students who are very progressive and open-minded, but they are less, they are more reserved in like, well, speaking out with their name unveiled, because they have a fear that they're being watched, or if they like being that vocal on the US continent, and when they go back to China, they will face a crackdown, or they will face consequences that they might not want to see.
We also, Alex, you might know more about this than I do, but as I remember it, there was a wall of Post-its down at Sproul Plaza expressing support. I think this was during the anti-extradition protests, and there was some conflict over people putting Post-its up and then other students taking them down. So that, yeah. I didn't actually see it. Students told me about it, but there's been some kind of like physical, I mean, I don't think there was any physical violence, but a physical site of contestation as people kind of express their political views about Hong Kong on the Berkeley campus.
Yeah, I recall that scenario. Like I was not there, but like my friends, they were there, and they exchanged words. But clearly you could also see like an ideological clivage between like, well, Hong Kong protesters and Chinese citizens. Like, well, in that particular scenario, folks from Hong Kong, they feel like there's like a very strong nationalistic sentiment from the Chinese participants. So it seems like, well, a particular faction or a specific faction of Chinese diaspora community that also like, well, share the nationalistic narrative of this or discourse launched by the Chinese regime. And so that also complicates the conversation because you always have to navigate the conversation very carefully, whether you will fall into the really dichotomized conversation, or you could really like, well, unpack it and open up the conversation to see what is at stake and what is really at the core of the conflict to make meaningful conversation happen between Chinese, Hong Kong, and Taiwanese audience or more.
Yeah. Let's see, what have we not talked about? I wanted to bring up a really interesting moment in the film that I think will get us into a conversation about class a little bit, and maybe also about intergenerational politics. I thought there was this really interesting moment where there was an interview with a young man dressed all in black on the stairs, who's part of the wave of violence against the police and the authorities in 2019. He talks about being haunted, years of being haunted by despair, and about the fact that his generation kind of can't be part of the Hong Kong dream, that they can't afford to have children. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what this interview means and what it brings up. I'll turn it over to Alex first. It's kind of your generation. So is this about the class anxieties of your generation? And of course, a generation is not monolithic. So to the extent to which there's cleavages within your generations that are either economic or political, I'd be interested to hear about that as well.
Sure. I could give it a try, and perhaps Evans and Shani could like, well, chime in. I think Rachel really catched the conflict. One of the core conflict in Hong Kong. We could say it is intergeneration, but or maybe we could say it is like a general conundrum facing Hong Kong. It's like it is about like, well, the economic future of Hong Kong. So many young folks, maybe it has been like for a decade or two, folks felt like, well, there's a lack of social mobility. They really don't see future. And they felt like there was always a good past Hong Kong in the past. And what is happening now and what's lying ahead is really like a future controlled by the Chinese regime. And like the local politics in specific, it is controlled by the property tycoons who really side with the Chinese regime. So they could like dominate the legislative council in Hong Kong to pass any bill they want and to really appoint the chief executive that they wish to see. And this kind of politics, being played out in Hong Kong, really depressed a lot of youngsters because they felt like, well, we couldn't afford to purchase housing. And then the government is not building public housing. And then the whole economy of Hong Kong is about finance, retail, and property. What else? It is not about creativity. If you are like a student from humanities or social sciences, you feel like, well, there's no place for you because you are being deemed as useless. And when it comes to whether you could propose any solution, it is always being Hong Kong as a city serving the greater interest of the Chinese regime, which has nothing to do with the Hong Kong people. So this kind of narrative or this kind of understanding is widely shared among youngsters. And they felt like the old folks, they tend to side with the Chinese regime and neglect the reality of what is happening in Hong Kong. And when we put Hong Kong into the global context, thinking Hong Kong's conundrum in terms of whether Hong Kong is reflecting a certain type of Chinese development is reaching a bottleneck, that it really has to change the political relationship between Hong Kong and China. Hong Kong really has no use, no longer has an economic use for a Chinese regime any longer. It's not like in the 1980s, it is 2020. Maybe Hong Kong is really losing its role to really preserve its privilege or to really maintain its autonomy. So that's one key struggle that that are facing a lot of the young folks in Hong Kong. Perhaps Evans could also unpack it further and tell us more what do you think about it as the director of the film?
Maybe not as the, well, I mean, I'm just talking about as an observer. You know, I've been, now I may consider myself a diasporic Hong Kong filmmaker, but actually my cultural identity is a hybrid. I mean, I always consider myself a director of Chinese descent, because I spent my childhood in Macau. I went to high school and college in Hong Kong, then grad school and lived in New York all these years. I mean, New York is the one place I've lived the longest, actually. So, but I mean, Hong Kong has always been my cultural anchor, so to speak, and a place I know best, and in a way, a place that I care about, because for my generation growing up in the 70s and 80s, we saw actually, at that point, we felt that we saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Many of the younger generations don't have any knowledge or recollection of the British colonial practice in Hong Kong. It wasn't nice, it wasn't pleasant. I worked in the English press for a while and I was very disgusted. But I mean, and then it was actually away from Hong Kong, I began to see what it has achieved. And whatever disgusting feeling I have about Hong Kong, actually I was being lucky in that window that afford me some freedom to pursue my future. And that kind of opportunities getting less and less. And that's one reason I feel a lot of sympathy for the young people who are, you know, coming into their own and finding themselves being challenged by the current situation. Of course, in the US, you're talking about the millennials now. I mean, there's so much frustration, you know, they graduate during the recession. Now there's the pandemic. And I mean, so their lives has been full of setback. But I have to tell you one really moment of revelation for me in terms of the plight of the young people. I was filming Raise the Umbrella actually at that time still. In 2015, I went back because there's the Legislative Council election. My father passed in 2006. You know, I grew up in public housing. You know, we were working class. But then, you know, there is this government scheme with a public housing. You can give up your public housing and trade it in and bought an apartment, you know, that the government, also some sort of government housing, but you can purchase your own apartment. So at that point, I was wondering, should I keep a place in Hong Kong? And I decided I should, because I mean, still I was working a lot there. So I bought an apartment at the time. So I purchased it for, I mean, sorry to talk about real estate, I mean, but it is what it is, and it is crucial, I think, for us to understand the plight of Hong Kong to some extent. So I pay $100,000 US for an apartment in Hong Kong. And then, so you are talking about 2006, 2007, and then in 2015, I was in Hong Kong. I have all these student interns helping me to film, you know, and this and that, and I have a rep party, 2015, and then they came to my place. So all these, you know, college kids, they haven't even graduated, including Nora Lam, who subsequently made her very popular film about Edward Leung, Lost in the Films. And so, I mean, you are talking about these people in their early 20s, basically. And all of a sudden, because I knew what my apartment at that point was worth, is worth $500,000 or so. I mean, so from 100,000 to be $500,000 in a matter of 6-7 years is significant. And I suddenly, it doesn't dawn on me, that's the kind of world they were born into. If they were in kindergarten in 2006, now they're in high school. And if they were in high school in 2006, now they are young college kids. Then these are the young people protesting. And I mean, so it is, that was really a moment of revelation. All of a sudden I realized, and the kind of advantages that my generation was getting. And I think to some extent it's also true of this country, you know, because all these boomers were, you know.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
Yeah, they were able to have, you know, purchase cheap property, and then, you know, then they retire by selling their property. But no, I mean, this is totally out of, you know, the realm of possibility for the younger generations, for the millennials in this country, and definitely in Hong Kong within a very compressed time frame. And I think that kind of intensification of that chasm in wealth, in opportunities in life, was really fueling the anger of a whole younger generation. And also they feel that, you know, the government was not doing anything for them. And they, for example, you know, China has been pushing all these mega projects in Hong Kong. You're talking about billions and billions of dollars being spent on mega projects that many people consider white elephants. And then, you know, the young people feel that they cannot stop those projects. And yet, you know, those money are not going to public housing or, you know, affordable housing. And I think that was really something that really fueled the anger of the younger generation. When you were young people, the chances are that you will be living with your parents maybe until late middle age. And what's the point of getting married then? How do you raise children? And I think those are the kind of despair that my interviewee were expressing.
Thank you for bringing that out. And it really, I mean, it's interesting to trace the ways in which Hong Kong is, of course, has all this historical uniqueness, but is also part of global trends. We have faced some of the same intergenerational dynamics around real estate here in the United States. We're going to have to end up in a minute, so let me just turn it over to Sheena. I want to make sure to bring in a regional perspective here. And just, we've been talking about the triad between Hong Kong, the US, and China, but of course, there's also East Asia as a region. What are the lessons that other countries are taking away from the Hong Kong experience of thinking about Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, maybe Thailand?
I think that's a great question. And one of the things that that we've seen is that there's been a little bit of regional differentiation. So Taiwan, for example, has really been at the forefront of creating a formal policy and offering resettlement assistance to Hong Kong residents. Been some critiques of the implementation of that, and that it should be administered differently and prioritized, people should be treated differently in that process. But I think it's worth noting that, however imperfect, that policy itself was one of the first to be announced and formally pursued by Taiwan. What's interesting about that is that, Tsai Ing-wen really, in framing that policy and the instruction to create a policy, really talked about it as an international issue, right? An issue of international freedom and human rights, rather than something that is contained to, the greater China, for lack of a better term. And I know that in Taiwan and Hong Kong, there is a lot of contestation of the degree to which people accept any part of that identity, right? So by saying that, I'm not intending to signal that construct is the right one. But in fact, what's interesting about Taiwan is the deliberate decision to promote this and to look at this, frame this as an international policy issue. And I think of that particularly as interesting because it's a contrast to, for example, how South Korea treats North Korean refugees and defectors, where it's very much a co-ethnic framing that kind of confines the issue to the Korean Peninsula. And so what I think we're seeing here is that this is, Hong Kong has always been a global city, right? For as long as someone of my vintage and my cohort has remembered it, and for much longer, right? Hong Kong has been a global city, and so I think part of what we're seeing here is that this really does, the national security law in particular, but this whole chain of events that is telescoped into the film, has called the credibility of the one country, two systems approach into fundamental question. And the reason why I think that matters is for a couple of reasons, right? It suggests that it was more important to Xi Jinping to establish complete or comprehensive control over Hong Kong society than it was even to reassure Taiwan and suggest that, one country, two systems has often been floated as like, look, it wouldn't be so bad. Taiwan, you could have one country, two systems. This is the way we do it. It would all be fine. And that looks a whole lot different now than it did in, say, 2005, 2006 even. But I think the other factor is that, the credibility of the CCP's restraint or, kind of limiting its own, the scope of its ambitions for governance and for regional sort of authority goes well beyond Hong Kong. And to an extent, I think we've seen some willingness to accommodate China's rise, work with China as a hugely influential economy in the Indo-Pacific, as long as China sort of suggested that its aims were more limited. And I think what we're seeing now is that, those statements may increasingly lack credibility. Like the stronger Xi Jinping is at home, the more China talks about sort of consolidating control in a place like Hong Kong, that I think we have to think about, how credible any promise that China will stick to limited aims can in fact be as the country's domestic and global power increase. And so I think that, you're likely to see, even though China tries to separate internal politics from foreign policy, I think that there will be some judgments made about the credibility of China's promises to adopt a limited role, because this is a case where a promise of a limited role simply, hasn't panned out as promised. And that was backed by an international guarantee in a way that a lot of China's other foreign policy promises aren't. And so I think there's a real risk that China's credibility in the region over time, right? I don't think you'll see this immediately. I don't think it'll be a day to night type switch. But I think it does raise more questions about how credible Chinese commitments are over the long term, especially those that require that other countries, for their own security, have faith in China's ability to put limits on its own power.
Thanks. I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you guys so much for the discussion. Evans, Alex, Sheena, thank you so much for joining and enhancing my own understanding of this film and of what's going on in Hong Kong.
The film is terrific, and I will say it's really a privilege to be able to participate. So thank you for arranging this. Evans, thank you for a wonderful film. Alex, thank you for your role as featured in the film. It's really a privilege to join you all.
Yeah, I thank all of you. I thought Rachel, and I learned so much from you too, Sheena, and Alice, of course. Yeah, thank you for participating in the film and participating in this kind of forum. And also thank you to San Diego Asian Film Festival, and of course Berkeley.
Thanks. Go Bears.
Hello, I'm Kathy Garretts, a film curator at BAMPFA. On the day we recorded this panel discussion, one of the key participants, Jerome Cohen, wasn't able to join the conversation due to technical difficulties. We are very grateful to him and to Evans Chan, director of We Have Boots, for making time to record this coda to the discussion so that we can benefit from his reflections on the recent events in Hong Kong. Jerome Cohen is Faculty Director Emeritus of New York University's U.S. Asia Law Institute. He's a leading U.S. expert on Chinese law and government who has been researching China's legal system since the early 1960s. It's my pleasure to welcome back Evans Chan to be in conversation with Jerome Cohen. I'm turning it over to you now, Evans.
Okay, thank you. To begin with, Jerry, I think it's still not too late for me to say happy birthday. For a milestone birthday like yours, you should be celebrating it all year round. Yeah, so in our last previous section, Rachel did lay out the basics of the new national security law promulgated in Hong Kong. Now, it was passed in late June, and it's been a few months. What do you think is happening in terms of its, number one, implication for the rest of the world? Because you are really the legal expert to see the evolution of Chinese law. And this is, part of the Chinese legal structure in a totally different world context from since, say, when you started. And so, number one, what is the implication? And number two, how do you see its implementation? And is it better or worse than your expectation, or what is happening then?
It's unfolding just about the way I predicted. The implications are multiple and they are profound, even if they're not yet very obvious to many people. First of all, the law has had an interim effect on the population in Hong Kong. It has quieted what had been fierce protests, and people now take account in their daily life, whether they're students at school or whether they're lawyers or business people in finance who have to now deal with the new law and the American and other governments' reactions to it. It's had an immediate, profound but not very obvious impact on life in Hong Kong. It's also had a very profound impact on the lives of many people abroad, especially people who are from Hong Kong or who may be going back to Hong Kong or even passing through the Hong Kong airport. People like me are subject to this new law, which is trying to have an intimidating effect upon us. Article 38 of the National Security Law for Hong Kong says that anybody, anywhere, who engages in actions that are deemed by the Hong Kong government or the national Chinese government to be detrimental to their interests is literally subject to being punished in Hong Kong or even in China mainland. Now that's outrageous. That goes beyond what Chinese national criminal law itself provides. And it goes beyond what international law will accept. Our talk today, literally, if you take seriously the facial language of Article 38 of this new law, is subject to punishment if they don't like what you or I say. So this is an interim immediate effect. Now we've already seen that certain people are being picked up and are being prosecuted in Hong Kong. And we're waiting to see how these prosecutions will unfold. But the PRC is moving gradually and quietly in this respect. But more sinisterly, it's moving immediately and equally quietly to make an impact on the people of Hong Kong by the new institutions that this new law has established in Hong Kong. You now have the secret police of China, the Ministry of Public Security, and the Ministry of State Security operating jointly, an office that is taking control of the legal enforcement, police and prosecution procedures in Hong Kong. This has never happened before. Before in Hong Kong, if the mainland wanted to extract someone from Hong Kong, they usually kidnapped them. They had to act surreptitiously and illegally. Last year, when the Hong Kong government and the mainland government tried to pass a new law that would permit the mainland to extradite legally, not kidnap, but legally extradite from Hong Kong people they accused of offenses. This led to the biggest protests Hong Kong streets have ever witnessed. And this pot has continued to boil, and that's what evoked the national security law roughly a year later in an attempt to bring peace and stability to Hong Kong. And this peace and stability is the peace of a desert. It's not real peace, it's not real stability. And it's being enforced daily by secretly operating mainland agents who, until this law, never had the authority to operate legally in Hong Kong. And now they have the authority and they're not subject to checks and balances of the previous Hong Kong governmental system. So this is a very serious situation, and we're going to see it unfold, I think, in terms of criminal prosecutions that will increase the intimidating effect of this new law. So I would say to you, Evans, be careful because your behavior, your wonderful creativity here in the US could be questioned and made subject to criminal prosecution in Hong Kong if you have offended the Hong Kong or mainland government. And even if you don't stop there, but you merely change planes there en route somewhere else in Asia, you could be taken off the plane. If you stay in America, they'll have a hard time getting at you because we have no functioning extradition agreement with Hong Kong, and we've never had an extradition agreement with the mainland, and we're not likely to have one unless mainland policies change in Hong Kong and on the mainland.
So what do you think has happened? Do you think China is doing itself a favor? I mean, so what exactly is happening? Do you think that there may be a negative impact on China's continuous rise on the global stage? And so what kind of world order are we entering then?
Well, you're raising a very profound question that's on the minds of thousands of people whose business it is to know about China from one point of view or another. Chinese economy has continued to develop despite the virus in an impressive fashion. Chinese political system has not developed. And indeed, in the last 8 years under Xi Jinping, it has made some retrogressive, shall we say, steps. And Chinese diplomacy in the world has suffered. The world is increasingly concerned that the Chinese government will not abide by some of the most important traditional rules of public international law. The terrible, horrible tortures, violations of human rights inflicted on the people of Muslim origin in the Xinjiang region of China, as well as the previous comparable steps taken to repress people in Tibet, have of course injured Chinese reputation. China wants soft power. Well, you don't get soft power by engaging in the outrageous behavior that the Chinese government has engaged in those places. Moreover, the world is learning about arbitrary detention, repression of freedoms of speech and expression in China itself, and the locking up campaigns against human rights lawyers and their human rights clients has hurt China. But now you have on top of this Hong Kong. And it's interesting. The Hong Kong new national security law, I think, has done more to alert the world to the increasingly repressive nature of the Xi Jinping government than all these other things, Xinjiang, Tibet, human rights lawyers. The world seems to some extent relatively impervious, but Hong Kong has been the battleground for human rights, political freedoms. And since June 30th, the enactment of this law, the world sees that this is not a mere handover by the British government as it was in 1997, but it's a takeover of Hong Kong. It's a violation of the expectations generated by the agreement between the UK and China, 1984, and by the basic law of Hong Kong, that there would be a high degree of autonomy and protections of civil liberties, including protections of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And now all of that seems to be dashed, and Beijing is suffering big, big damage to its international reputation. But that is important, yet secondary to the authorities of the communist dictatorship. What they are concerned about is stability. They want confirmation that they will control not only mainland China, but also Hong Kong. That's foremost. The survival, perpetuation of power of the Chinese Communist Party is critical. And this law is critical to achieving that goal.
So you think, the US election is coming up. You expect any difference in the reaction by either the Trump administration in the future, or if he gets reelected for the second term, or Biden administration? Do you think there's any continuity in terms of America's China policy?
There will be, if Biden wins, as so many of us hope, there will be a change in our China policy. It will not, I think, enormously affect Hong Kong because the Democratic Party is very much concerned, as is the Republican Party, about the present plight of Hong Kong and its future. You may see some modification of the rhetoric. You'll have a president who isn't constantly changing his views and saying objectionable things that are not representative of a consistent policy toward China. But there will be continuing concern about the new national security law, but it will be in a different context. Right now, in order to get reelected, Trump decided rather belatedly that he would do an all-out, whole-of-government opposition to the People's Republic of China, because that would sell with an American public that is increasingly disillusioned with the Xi Jinping regime. Well, if the election's over, that motive will disappear. And I think responsible players, certainly in the Democratic Party, will realize we cannot have all-out Cold War risking hot war with China, that we have to have a moderate policy, one that holds out the promise of cooperation with China on so many issues that US-China cooperation really is required. Climate, of course, is one of the key things, and the environment, and even economic cooperation in the future, and not to mention outer space and cyber and all these other areas that cry out for control. We need to cooperate with China, and it's in China's interest. At the same time, we will inevitably compete with China in some economic respects, and we certainly are going to try to resist any Chinese attempts to use force or pressure, coercion, to expand the PRC's jurisdiction. I think the Democratic Party will oppose efforts to restrict freedom of the press in Australia and the United States and Canada and other places. It will restrict PRC efforts to interfere in various ways with the operation of democratic governments. And it will try to protect the human rights of the Chinese people through inventive, energetic, multilateral cooperation with the liberal democracies of the world. So there'll be a change in our China policy from the current Trump policy, but it's not going to be one that's going to give up on the rights of people in Hong Kong or elsewhere in China. Hong Kong, however, is the battleground. And that's where there'll be attempts to do what we can for the people of Hong Kong, or at least to enable those who want to leave and can leave to go elsewhere and live a more democratic life. So foreign policy is not simple, and we can only hope that the Beijing government will respond to a greater extent than it has Deng Xiaoping was hardly a civil libertarian at home. He was a Stalinist in repressive behavior, but he was a compromiser. He was flexible in his international relations. That's how Hong Kong got back to China in the first place. Deng could show flexibility. That's how we managed to establish diplomatic relations with China in 1979, despite our continuing concern, which continues today, to protect Taiwan. That's why China and Japan haven't gone to war over the islands and the waters that separate them. Because Deng had foresight internationally and he had flexibility, confidence, and power. Xi Jinping sees no compromise. He is rigid internationally, just as he is rigid at home. And this presents us with a very dangerous situation.
And so what should people in Hong Kong to expect? What would you counsel them? How would you counsel them in terms of them carrying on their daily lives, and which is quite different now than before, I would think.
You know, I've lived in Hong Kong for a total of 10 years, on and off, starting with my first visit in 1961. I lived there under the colonial government in 63-4, and I've developed a lot of experience there and the greatest respect for Hong Kong people. I ran a law firm there for a great many years that dealt with China and Hong Kong. So I have confidence in not only the ability of the people in Hong Kong and their tenacity and their desire for autonomy and free life that they can engage in earning a living, and that their children can have the best possible education, not one corrupted by communist totalitarianism. So we have to devise ways to deal with the current depressing situation. Hong Kong people are very clever and they have a great sense of humor. They've already developed some ways to show, without violent protest, without going into the streets by the millions as they've done before, that they oppose what's going on. On the other hand, Beijing is taking steps to counter that. We just had amendments to the national emblem law of China and to the national flag law of China that are part of a Beijing effort to control the symbols of public life, the total physical surroundings of people in Hong Kong, as well as the education of their children and the expression of political views publicly. Beijing is doing everything possible. But we have to help also. And to some extent, some of these sanctions that the United States is applying to Hong Kong and mainland leaders who were responsible for carrying out the national security law will have an impact on the banks and the rest of the financial community in Hong Kong. That may be helpful, but we have to be very careful in the application of those sanctions. But a lot can be done in international forums, in every international meeting, and every bilateral and multilateral negotiation with China. Steps can be taken to condemn what the PRC is doing and to discourage them through the application of various measures. It's not going to be easy. Democracy is on the backward foot in Hong Kong, but the battle isn't over. And it's a challenge. And of course, people in Taiwan are very concerned about what's going on in Hong Kong, and not only in Chinese areas, of Asia, where Chinese culture prevails, even in Thailand, which has a significant but not dominant Chinese influence ethnically. You have the current upset, the protests against the, you might say, the king's dictatorship and the king military dictatorship. Those protests are gaining support from the experience in Hong Kong, just as Hong Kong protesters are trying to learn and cooperate with Thailand. So in a way, you could say democracy is contagious, even while it's subject to great repression.
So one last question from me is that, so, I mean, you just talk about the options of sanctioning and all that, but don't you also worry, and there has been worries, actually those sanctions may be hurting people in Hong Kong, you know, people's ordinary citizens' life, more than it hurt the government?
That's why I said one has to be very careful and discreet about the selective application of these sanctions. We don't want to try to save Hong Kong by destroying it. And it's not going to be a simple balance. We'll have to balance what are the prospects for various actions having a beneficial effect. Of course, there are many people in Hong Kong who are encouraging us, take those actions. Money isn't everything. Economy isn't everything. But we do know Hong Kong people are very practical. And for those who have to stay, they don't want to see the economy crash. And to some extent, the Hong Kong economy has benefited from the fuss over Hong Kong, because although America is taking steps to restrict Beijing companies investing in America, that's sending them to Hong Kong. The Hong Kong stock market is benefiting to a considerable extent. And it may be Beijing will take extra steps to boost the economy of Hong Kong. But we're, of course, cognizant of the fact we do not want to take actions that will be significantly harmful to the economy of Hong Kong. And that's a challenge. Just a blatant application of sanctions would be very undesirable. And we see even now under Trump, things are moving relatively cautiously, because many people, even in the Trump government, are aware of the implications of sanctions that will harm the livelihood of the ordinary people of Hong Kong, who haven't asked for Beijing's repression, who don't support it, and who are not allowed to openly express their opposition. So this is a challenge. Nobody said it was easy.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Cohen. It was a great pleasure talking to you, and it's my honor for you to join this forum. And I do want to, basically my mission is to present this film to the world, and I try to be a witness and observer of what's going on in Hong Kong. And your opinions are very valuable to us.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with the film, and we need similar efforts on a great scale, and I'm sure you'll continue, if you don't get locked up in Hong Kong, to make a contribution.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Yeah. So, Kathy?
So on behalf of BAMPFA and the San Diego Asian Film Festival, I want to thank you both for this really fascinating and informative conversation. It's been an honor for us to have both of you, as well as all of the other panelists, contribute your thoughts and reflections to this panel to accompany the screening of Evans Chan's films at both BAMPFA and the San Diego Asian Film Festival. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Nice chatting with you. Yeah. I dedicate the Californian streaming of the 3 films I made in the last 6 years, Raise the Umbrellas, We Have Boots, and Love and Death in Montmartre, to the memory of my late husband, Russell Friedman, who died in early 2018. Russell Friedman was a San Francisco native and an alumnus of UC Berkeley, who became an acclaimed author of nonfiction books for young readers. He had won many awards, including the Newbery Medal and the National Humanities Medal. He has written books on Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Marian Anderson, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s involvement with Selma and the Montgomery bus boycott. He had helped me to understand the global circulation of the ideas of civil disobedience and the continuing struggles for democracy everywhere. He was credited as the associate producer in all my films for the moral and intellectual support I had received from him throughout the years. So I really would appreciate this streaming is happening. And I would especially like to thank Kathy Gerritz and Brian Wu for programming these 3 films. And I really appreciate the support team of both institutions to make this event possible. Thank you all, and I enjoy the intelligent conversation with everybody on this panel.